Hi, I'm Tom. Welcome again to Toys versus the Real McCoys. What I'm going to do is just take a few minutes and go over some of the remaining tractors that I have in my collection, and these are all primarily antique. I've got a couple that are newer, but these are kind of the ones that are special. And at one point my collection numbered in excess of like 200 of these. These are the 1/16th scale toys, but I've since sold off all the ones that just didn't seem like they were very important to me and replaced them with some of these traditional ones that I just think are a lot more special. They're more reminiscent of my childhood because a lot of the toys that I had were hand-me-downs from my siblings. So I've got a couple of lawn and garden tractors here to start out. And this one here's a Cub Cadet, and I don't know what model it is. It's got some miles on it, and so the steering doesn't work quite as well as it used to, but it does have the original dump cart still. And I've seen the literature. Actually, just about all of the toys that I have the original sales brochure or something of that nature. And this was Cub Cadet's trailer. They had a steel one, like the number 80 that John Deere had, like this one. But this one here was the one that they touted that, you know, had a dump angle and you could dump it from the seat. And the problem with these in real life is there's always material like right here, so you still have to get back with a shovel or a rake and clean that out. But it's a cool little tractor. Like I said, it's got some miles on it. The steering doesn't work like it used to, but it's all intact. It still has the blade on it. And then I've got this right here, this original John Deere 110 with the 80 cart on it, and it has this little dump mechanism on it. The thing is like when Erdl, Eska, Carter used to make these, they put a lot of detail in them, and at some point in the 70s they just kind of dropped off on detail until they were kind of plain. And then when they started making them in China, they added detail back, but the problem with the Chinese ones is they're not very robust and they don't take sustained playing very well. They tend to fall apart. But this is the 80 cart here, and the original 110 here with the hand lift on that side, and then you get the variator here. Next piece I have is a John Deere 450 sickle bar mower, and it's one of these ones that has the rib tires on it, which I absolutely despise because they don't get any traction, especially the plastic ones. But the way this worked was there's a cog. There's actually two cogs on this tire, so when it spins, it pops this up and down, which sends the knife moving back and forth, and you can barely see it, I'm sure, on camera, but it would you can see the sliding there. So that's kind of cool. And the 450 was basically the 350 John Deere mower that was a trailer mower, and I have never been a fan of trailer mowers. I guess they're okay in like out west where you've just got endless flat ground, but up here in Maine where we have rock walls, trees, and obstacles, you can't really get in corners very well with it, whereas the mounted mower, you can back the tractor up and cut in the corner. But this was the one that was sold by Erdl that I had showed you previously, and I did repair it. I put a steering wheel on it, but if you remember, the original ones of these that were made by Fred Erdl Sr., they did not steer. So they were a pretty detailed tractor, actually. I mean, you got to remember that he made these casts in his house and used his home coal furnace, his heating furnace, to heat the aircraft aluminum from defective pistons to make these. And that's why they're die cast metal. They're two sets of dies that they pour liquid aluminum in, and then after it dries, they sandwich the pieces together, paint it, put some rivets through to hold it, and put the tires on. And so the first ones of these that Fred Erdl Sr. made, they were all handmade. He did all the casting, and his wife put the tires on and painted them. And at some point in the late 40s, early 50s, Fred Erdl went back to John Deere, which is the company he worked for. He was laid off, and that's why he was trying to make extra money, and got the okay from John Deere to patent and reproduce some of their tractors. And so this was the first one that they made. Eventually, around 1948, his son Fred Erdl Jr. took over, and he was in charge for a long time. But I think Tommy or somebody bought him out at some point. And then, you know, by the 70s, the quality I just think went down the toilet. They just weren't robust, and like I said, the detail wasn't there anymore. They cut a lot of corners to save costs. This here's one of my favorite tractors, and I don't know if it's a 630 or 730. There's no numbers on the side of it, but this is when Ertl went to the newer style rim, and this is still die cast, and it has the float ride seat in it, and I think it's float ride. I'm not sure. It's the carryover from the old A and 60 seat, but it's got the fenders. And so with the 30 series John Deere, they put a slanted dashboard on it to make it more ergonomic. They really focused on customer or operator comfort, and so the 30 series used the same motors that were in the 20 series. So a 630 or 730 had the exact same motor as a 620 or 720, 520, 420, etc. But it's just a really cool tractor, and it's one of my favorites. It has a 3-point hitch on it, and there's a lever here that operates the 3-point hitch. The steering works on it, and it's so cool. It's really one of my favorite tractors. No farm would be complete without a red belly Ford, and this is an 8N Ford tractor from Ertl in the 80s, and it had a 3-point hitch, so it had the Ferguson system on it with the Fordson 2-bottom plow. And the whole selling point of the Fordson, which was Ford Ferguson, and was the 3-point hitch, and that was because the earlier Ford tractors, they had a tendency to rear over backwards, and this 3-point hitch made it so that if the tractor started to catch on an obstacle, instead of the front end rearing up, this top link right here would put pressure on it. So it was basically impossible to flip this tractor upside down at that point. It would lose traction way before it would come over backwards. People really liked these tractors because they were the only tractor really that Ford made at the time. They had the 2N, the 9N, and then they improved it with the 8N with a 4-speed transmission in it. And at some point, the handshake, the legendary handshake agreement with Henry Ford and Harry Ferguson came to a close when Henry Ford II took over. And so there was a giant lawsuit, and these tractors don't have live hydraulics, so if you push the clutch in, the hydraulics stop, and it was transmission driven, so you had to have the clutch, the clutch out, which is actually in, to make the hydraulics work. And then Ford came out with the Jubilee, the NAA, in 53 and 54, which had live hydraulics on it. So as long as the motor was running, you had fingertip control of the hydraulics. The 8N and the Jubilee, they're really nice tractors because you could pretty much hook on and unhook from the seat. They sat low, they had good stability, and they had a really good reputation of quality because it was the only tractor they had, right? So the one thing that my family tells me with the 8Ns that we've had on our farm was just that once they got hot, they didn't want to restart until they cooled off, and so they used to have some issues with it. And also, these tractors kind of had a lightweight front end on them, so when you started adding loaders on it, it really put a lot of wear on the spindles and the bearings, and so they didn't do so well. But that's true with all the utility tractors at the time. They just didn't overbuild the front end to manage that, and plus they didn't have power steering, so it was a real beast. And with these tractors, the frame was just this giant thing, so you were kind of trapped inside it, and I've seen them, but it's not something I'd want to have. But anyway, this is a legendary tractor in my mind. I think this kind of was right there with the John Deere Model A and the Farmhole M, as far as basically one of the tractors that built America, as far as I'm concerned. So 8N, Jubilee, those are all just really cool tractors to have, and I do like all brands of tractors. It's just that there weren't other dealerships around. We had a Ford dealership, John Deere, and an International Harvester, so those are the toys that I got, right? There was no Massey or Alice Chalmers or anything, so these are the ones I have because that's what was available at the time. My favorite tractors was the 20 series that John Deere came out with in 1960, and after International Harvester had troubles with the 560, 460 transmission failures, which was it's really a travesty because International went above and beyond to repair the damage, but these new tractors from John Deere had come out at the time, and they were really focused on comfort and quality. And so John Deere started about 1960 to really outpace International Harvester. And these 20 series or 10 series, these are what I call legendary John Deeres. These are probably the newest, most radical change of tractor, in tractor history, because they just went from the old Poppin' Johnnies to these 4 and 6 cylinder tractors with diesels, and they like a 730 that this would have replaced was so much heavier with a little bit less horsepower, and so these tractors were good runners. And this tractor, I can't tell if it's a 3010 or a 3020. They look exactly the same to me, and I don't have that much of a trained eye. Even though we have a 4020 on the farm, they just look kind of the same. But you get the idea. It's the next generation tractors, and this one has a 3-point hitch on it as well. Version of the tractor, there was no more lever on it, so there was no handle to do it, but it still went up and down. And you got the tail wheel here, and so this is a semi-mount 4-bottom plow. So this is just one of the things that Earl made that was so cool, because they had a 3-point hitch, and then they made an attachment to go on the 3-point hitch, so it was just like Dad's. It was just a really cool piece to have. I do have a lot of the boxes for my tractors, and they're not all in the boxes, but the boxes are around. And I have this one right here, and this is from the 80s, and it could be from the early 90s too, but it's still the older style box. The old ones older than this actually were green and yellow, so it's kind of a transitional one. But I believe this is like a 320, and this came out, it would have had to have been after 1988 or so, when they started transitioning from the traditional 2 or 300 series, like the 318, 316, and 212, 214. They went to these tractors with electronic ignition, and they did away with a lot of the quick implement attachments where you could have 2 or 3 attachments on, and there were legacy attachments that fit on all the stuff before. Like you could have a late 1960s John Deere 140 and put the parts, or the attachments on like a 318, but they did away with that around 1989, and this was one of the 300 series, and I think this was the only 300 series for a period of time. It was the 320. It had hydraulic lift on it, and it was kind of a cool tractor. It was one of the ones where they went to the supposedly easier attachment parts and pieces. But so I have this one, the 320 with the 80 cart, and so John Deere made this 80 cart for a lot of years, and there's different versions of it. There's like a brass tag version, there's some decal changes, etc. But it was a shame they stopped building this cart, because it was just indestructible. It had like a piece of steel pipe around the edges of it, and so it was really rugged. It was a couple of bolts to take out to remove the tailgate, so it went from like a dump truck tailgate to no tailgate. But it's only 8 cubic feet, and I think it only held like 500 pounds, maybe, I'm not sure anymore, 800 pounds. But it was just an indestructible trailer. And so I actually have a real one of these, and it's one of those things that I will never in my lifetime let go. And so like I said, I do have a few of these newer ones, and this one here is one that I got in high school. It's a John Deere A. It's one of the, before, I think, what year did they style them? 38 maybe, 30, something like that. But this is the unstyled John Deere A, and then they had the A here. And after I think 1947, maybe 48, they changed the whole frame situation of these tractors, and they changed the axle, so it didn't say John and Deere on it anymore. The last A's and B's that came out, they had a cyclone air induction, so it had like an eyebrow over where the air came in, and so they had a long production run of the John Deere A, and they made a lot of changes to it over its lifetime. And so it's very important that when you're looking for parts, that not any John Deere A part will fit. There's a certain serial number that parts fit in. So if you have a John Deere A, it's very important that you follow that serial number. Similarly, I've got a John Deere B, which basically looks like the A, but it's smaller. And so it's like 2/3 the size. But I think the John Deere B is one of my favorite tractors. it's just it's like the John Deere 50 took its place, but this one has the late 30s steel wheels on it with rubber, and that was a huge improvement on the tractors in the 30s. Farmers started either one cutting the spokes and mounting a steel wheel on it and putting rubber, or they just had the wheels changed, etc. But you see a lot of them with just rubber on the front. A lot of the farmers were actually reluctant to put rubber on. They didn't think it would be as strong as steel, but it was a lot less of a tooth rattler, and it proved to be a really nice improvement. During the World War II, when rubber became a shortage, a lot of the tractors that were sold, I understand there were no new models available, but the ones that were sold during the war didn't have batteries because copper was a commodity, as was rubber. So they didn't come with starting and lighting equipment, and they didn't come with rubber tires. So this one right here would have been either, well, it would have had to have been a pre-World War II tractor because of the style, but with the rubber tires on it. Here's the Farmhole H, and these were styled by Lowy. He was a renowned designer, engineering designer, industrial designer back in the 30s, and I believe here's a Farmhole Super C, and this replaced the Farmhole C in 1951. So in 47, International came out with a Super A, and that replaced the A, and that was the first one to have touch control on it. And so this was to combat the Ferguson system, because it actually was pretty. Here's a perfect example. I've got a John Deere 620 row crop tractor with an International 2-row harvester on it, and so new idea. They could put a new idea or some of these other harvesters on different manufacturers' tractors, and it was just a really cool thing that they designed their equipment to fit on their competitors' tractors, because they knew that not all their farmers drove that manufacturer's tractor, but they could still sell implements to them, and so that was genius in my mind. And so this is a corn picker, 2-row mounted corn picker, and these kind of fell out of fashion in the 60s, I'm thinking early 60s, because they were such a pain to put on and off. And pull type implements just really came into favor. They increased the technology on those to make it just more feasible. But it was really a bear to put these on and take these off. And so a lot of these ended up either in the scrapyard or parked in fence rows. And so it's a shame that not a lot of these in real life have survived. And true to the old scale design, this has a lever here which will lower and raise the snouts. Here's where the corn goes in here, and so it strips the cobs off. If you had a sheller, there was a sheller attachment, which is basically a pipe, and so shelling the corn would take the cobs and do basically what a combine does. It strips the corn kernels off the cobs and then just sends the kernels back. This here is just a corn picker, so it basically it drives into 2 rows of corn, pulls it up, and it goes into the chains. It takes the ears off and then just throws the rest of the garbage back on the ground. And so only one thing that came out of here was ears of corn. But the 620, basically the same thing as the 60, a little bit more horsepower, a little bit more ergonomics, and they went to that. One of the things that was in fashion in the 50s was streamlining and two-tone paint jobs. And so John Deere and International weren't to be outdone. John Deere came out with this yellow stripe down the side, and I think that really improves the looks of these tractors a lot. There's a good contrast there. And so here's I give you the John Deere 60. This one here's actually got the crank on it that'll pick up the rake head and put it down. And contrary to the other one, this one actually has the ag tires on it, so it turns the teeth like that when you turn the tires. So it's actually, this is really a cool tractor to have too. Oh, I'm sorry. Remember I had showed you another one of these true scale choppers, and it didn't have the teeth on it on the pickup. So you can put the pickup down here, and then you can see the teeth, pickup teeth picking it up. So I've got these two versions of Cubs, and I've actually got another one out in the barn I forgot to bring in, but this right here is a 1950, probably 6 or to 58 version of the Farmhole Cub. It's got the two-tone paint on it and the white grill. Basically unchanged from the original Cub at that point. Still 6 volts, still about 10 horsepower. It was really aimed at farmers who had less than 40 acres, and they started designing it right about the time World War II broke out, and then they had to table it until the end of the war, and so they released this in 1947. The touch control wasn't ready in 1947, but they made the tractor in 1947 to be able to accept it retroactively in 1948 when the touch control was complete. And so concurrently with the Super A, the Cub got touch control, which was independent hydraulics, and it was just a really cool thing. But unlike the Super A that had 2 rock shafts and one on each side, the Cub only had one unit, and so even though there was an attachment point on both sides, it was still one cylinder, so that you could only really raise and lower one attachment at a time. And there was a rod that went back to lift up your cultivators or your plows that were on the back, but three speeds, 8 by 24, and I think these were 12 by 4-inch front tires. They had a complete set. I think they had about 30 attachments really that came out with this, but this was Farmhole's attempt to get the last of the small farmers who had a mule, about 40 acres less, to buy a tractor, and these were incredibly inexpensive to buy, and they sold a lot of them. It wasn't the largest seller, like the H&M outsold the Cub by a lot, but they made the Cub from 47 until 1979, which here's a yellow one, and so this is a long stripe, so this would be 75 or so to 79. The last year they made the Cub, they made them all with a long stripe, the blue and black long stripe, but they were red. And all along, even though they came out with these in 1964, they changed the Cub to the square design. They came with horsepower, and they also had 12 volts. It was one of the big selling points of the Cub. So they went from 6 to 12 volts, and they went from a generator to an alternator, but essentially unchanged all through its production. They retooled the factory in Louisville 2 or 3 times, and in the mid-70s, after Kubota had started selling tractors in the United States, and yes, they were crude, but John Deere, Ford, and International Harvester realized that there was a market for these small diesel tractors, so they all came out with a small compact diesel tractor in the 70s. John Deere had the 850, 950 that came out like 1978, and that was one of the first John Deeres that was a diesel, small, compact tractor aimed at the hobby farmer, or the small farm, or secondary tractor for a mid-sized farm. International had the 284, which was a Mazda tractor, had a Mazda motor, and then they teamed with Mitsubishi Japan to come out with some other tractors. But by the mid-70s, International knew the Cub's days were numbered. They didn't sell a lot of them because they didn't have a 3-point hitch. They didn't have live power. They only had 3 speeds. So the technology was old. They didn't sell very many. And so the nail was in the coffin. By the mid-70s, the last Cubs were redesigned in 1975, I believe, and they went up to about 15 horsepower for these, and the Cub Lowboys had about 18, but it was still the same motor they had their entire production run. Here's a Farmhole 706, and this was a true scale tractor that didn't have a model number. It was just a tractor, and just has the straight drawbar on the back. It does have the flip-up seat, which is kind of cool. The rubber muffler. And they made a couple of these versions. They made one with a wide front end with front wheel assist to copy the Farmholes. So this is a true scale 706, which my brother-in-law had one on his farm, but it was sold when I was little, so I don't remember much about it, other than it was a big tractor and they used to chop corn with it. And they sold that and bought a a 4430, I believe, and then they sold the 4430 and bought a 4020, which they still have. This right here is a 560 Farmhole, and as I mentioned, this was the one that caused them a lot of grief. But up here in New England, we didn't really have trouble with them because we weren't hauling giant tillage tools up here, so they didn't really have a lot of issues with them here in Maine. They sold some. I see them around once in a while, but you know, the late 50s, the farmers were still kind of hanging on to their Super M's, and they didn't sell as many of these as you'd think they did. So the 560, 460 came out at the same time. They had 6-cylinder motors. They had a diesel or gas, and they were like the ultimate culmination of the Farmhole M. They increased the engine, increased the hydraulics, increased the, you know, the overall aesthetics of the tractor, but they were still using the same transmission that was in the old M. And even though they had a torque amplifier on it, which would give you another whole set of gears, they didn't really do anything to beef up the transmission to compensate for the increased horsepower of the tractor. And ultimately, when they were working hard out in the Midwest hauling tillage tools, they started to just basically disintegrate. And like I said, International, they really went above and beyond. They hauled them all back in, and it cost them millions of dollars to retroactively fix these tractors, and they did a really good job of doing so. But the damage was done, and ultimately John Deere took over. Before the 560 came out, there was the 450, which replaced the 400, which replaced the Super M. And you can see this is a 1956 to 58 version with the white here, and the white nose has a fast hitch on it. And this was an Esca tractor, and it just has a fast hitch, which the drawbar comes out, which is cool, but there's no lift on it. So it shows you like the little pretend hydraulic cylinder, but it's fixed. It doesn't raise or lower. Now these front wheel assemblies on here, you can see how fine that is. It's very authentic, but it's also extremely fragile. It's paper thin. These wheels right here are paper thin, and if this tractor was dropped at all, it would be destroyed. And so not a lot of these survive. They have some they call a split rim, and you know, I don't know anything about that. The 400 maybe sells more than the 450, but I'm happy to have this tractor. It's a really nice piece. It's in very good shape, and it's one of my favorite tractors. Here's a 340, which came out about the same time as the 460, 560. It shared the same front end. 140 and the Cub got this same styling on it. They called it a 4-bar grill on the Cub. I don't know what it was on the 140, probably the same, but they just made all their tractors to share the same family resemblance. This was kind of like aircraft steel with some cool lettering on it and some fluting on the side of it. And the 340 was a good tractor. It came in either the utility like this one or the Farmhole row crop version, and they came with either with a pan seat or the deluxe seat. The battery was relocated back here, so it wasn't a fire hazard. It had three spools of hydraulics. You could have one on each side here for a loader, and you had one back here for the drawbar. Really a good tractor. They had issues with them, like I said, with the Fordson, where the front spindles weren't as robust as they should have been, like the 300, 350, etc. And so with the swept back axle, it kind of changed the center of gravity of the tractor, and yeah, they could cut really short because the axle was swept back. But with the loader out here, it really made the tractor kind of tail light, and so they, as we say, spin on a horse turd. These tractors, you know, were a great utility tractor, but when you started putting loader on it, it's almost like you couldn't put enough weight on the back to make it effective. And so here I've got two versions of the 404, which you've got the utility and the row crop version. Pretty much the same tractor, just different applications. And so the utility version here has a 3-point hitch on it with a lever. By the time that the 404 came out, and 504, 706, you could get them 656. You could get them with either the 3-point or the legendary fast hitch. International refused to sell their patent for the fast hitch. John Deere actually wanted to buy it, but they wouldn't sell it to them. And so ultimately what happened was, you know, if you're the only person making a fast hitch and everybody else is going 3-point hitch, the patent had expired. It was available to everybody, and so International really shot themselves in the foot by not letting anybody else have the fast hitch, because it goes on and off in a click, snap. But yeah, here's the row crop tractor. Basically the same tractor, but it sat a little bit higher. So instead of the wheels, swept back, they were underneath. So it gave you more crop clearance. And so that's pretty much all I have for tractors to show you. And I really appreciate everybody who has given me their attention. And I just thought it was a cool thing to do, to show you some of these old tractors that I have, and kind of give you a background of why I like tractors so much. Because I've, my first birthday I got a toy tractor. If you haven't already, please take a moment, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and we'll talk to you next time.